Close your eyes now, and let yourself drift back through the centuries, back to a time when stone castles rose against grey skies, when the clang of swords echoed through cobblestone streets, and when survival meant making choices that history has often chosen to forget. Tonight, we journey into the shadows of medieval Europe, into the hidden corners of castle life, into the untold stories of women whose existence has been whispered about, judged, and almost entirely erased from the pages of history. This is the story of medieval prostitutes, the women who lived on the margins of society, yet were woven into the very fabric of castle life and urban existence. Their stories are not simple, they are not comfortable, but they are profoundly human, and they deserve to be told. So settle into your pillows, relax your breathing, and prepare to discover a world that existed in the gaps between what history books usually tell us. A world of survival, of exploitation, of surprising complexity, and of women who navigated impossible circumstances in a time when they had almost no power at all. Let us begin. Part 1. The world they inhabited. To understand the lives of medieval prostitutes, we must first understand the world they lived in. A world so different from our own that it requires us to set aside modern assumptions and step fully into the medieval mindset. Medieval Europe stretched from roughly the 5th century to the 15th century, 1,000 years of human history marked by feudalism, religious dominance, constant warfare, and rigid social hierarchies. The castle was not just a military fortification, it was the beating heart of feudal power, a self-contained world where lords ruled over vast estates and the people who worked them. Picture a castle in the 13th century, perhaps in England, France, or the Germanic territories. Massive stone walls rise up from the landscape, towers pierce the sky, and inside these walls exists an entire community. There are knights and soldiers, servants and craftsmen, cooks and stable hands, laundresses and seamstresses, and among this complex social ecosystem, often hidden in plain sight, were the women who sold sexual services. The medieval world was intensely hierarchical. Society was divided into 3 estates: those who prayed, the clergy, those who fought, the nobility, and those who worked, everyone else. Women existed within this structure with virtually no independent legal status. A woman was always under the authority of a man, her father, her husband, her brother, or her lord. This lack of autonomy meant that women had few options for survival. Marriage was the expected path, but marriage required a dowry, and many families could not afford to provide one for all their daughters. The church offered another option through convents, but again, this required a dowry or donation. For women without family support, without resources, without protection, the options narrowed to a stark few. They could work as servants, earning barely enough to survive and often subject to the sexual demands of their employers anyway. They could attempt skilled trades. Though guilds were almost entirely closed to women, they could beg, risking starvation and violence on the streets, or they could sell the one thing they possessed that had value in a male-dominated world: their bodies. This was not a choice made lightly, and it was rarely a choice made freely. It was a calculation of survival, in a world that offered women almost no safe paths. The medieval attitude towards sexuality was complex and deeply contradictory. The church taught that sex was sinful except within marriage, and for the purpose of procreation. Lust was one of the 7 deadly sins. Women were simultaneously viewed as weak, prone to sin, and dangerously seductive, daughters of Eve who led men astray. Yet medieval society was also pragmatic. Men, particularly young unmarried men, were seen as naturally lustful, and this lust was considered a potential threat to social order. If young men could not find sexual outlets, the thinking went they might rape respectable women, seduce married women, or engage in other forms of sexual misconduct that would disrupt the careful social hierarchy. Prostitution, therefore, came to be seen by many authorities as a necessary evil. It was sinful, yes, condemned by the church, certainly, but it also served a social function. It provided an outlet for male lust that protected respectable women, meaning married women and unmarried virgins of the propertied classes. This pragmatic tolerance varied greatly by time and place. Some cities actively regulated prostitution, creating official brothels and red light districts. Others attempted to suppress it through laws and punishment, but everywhere, in every castle, in every town, in every corner of medieval Europe, prostitution existed. The castle itself was a microcosm of medieval society, and like society at large, it contained contradictions. It was a place of both great wealth and poverty, of refined courtly love poetry and brutal violence, of religious devotion and casual exploitation. Castles were military installations, which meant they housed soldiers and knights. Men who lived with violence, who were often away from wives and families, and who viewed the sexual use of lower status women as a privilege of their rank. Castles were also economic centres, drawing merchants, craftsmen and labourers, and castles were political centres, hosting visiting nobles, clergy and foreign dignitaries who travelled with large retinues. All of this meant that castles had transient male populations, men with money or power, men who created demand for commercial sex. The women who met this demand occupied a strange position in castle life. They were simultaneously visible and invisible, necessary and despised, tolerated and persecuted. Their presence was an open secret, acknowledged by everyone and discussed by no one in polite company. Some worked openly in taverns and alehouses near castles. Others operated more discreetly, summoned when needed and dismissed when not. Some were servants who supplemented meagre wages with sexual services. Others were itinerant women who travelled from castle to castle, town to town, following armies and courts. What united them was vulnerability. They existed outside the protection of family and respectable society. They were subject to violence, disease, poverty, and the constant threat of harsher punishment should authorities decide to crack down. They aged out of desirability quickly in a society that valued female youth above all, and they carried the moral stain of their profession in a deeply religious culture that saw them as irredeemable sinners. Yet they persisted. They survived. They found ways to navigate a system designed to exploit them, and their stories, fragmented as they are, reveal truths about medieval life that the official records prefer to ignore. Before we can understand these women's lives, we must understand one more crucial thing: the nature of historical evidence itself. Almost everything written in the medieval period was written by men, specifically by educated men of the church or nobility. These men had little interest in recording the experiences of poor women, and less interest in recording the experiences of women they considered sinful. When prostitutes appear in medieval records, it is almost always in legal documents, court records of arrests, guild regulations excluding them, city ordinances restricting them, or sermons condemning them. We rarely hear their own voices, we rarely learn their names, we rarely discover what they thought, what they felt, what they hoped for. To reconstruct their lives, historians must read between the lines, must look at economic records, archaeological evidence, medical texts, literary sources, and legal documents, and must carefully piece together a picture from fragments. This means that much of what we know is incomplete, and much remains speculation based on the best available evidence. But even these fragments tell powerful stories, stories of resilience and tragedy, stories that demand to be remembered. Now that we have set the stage, let us enter more deeply into the lives themselves. Part 2. Paths to prostitution. How did a woman become a prostitute in medieval times? This question has no single answer, because there was no single path. Each woman's story was unique, shaped by her circumstances, her choices, limited as they were, and the accidents of fate. But there were common patterns, common forces that pushed women towards selling sex. And understanding these patterns helps us see these women not as moral failures, but as human beings responding to impossible situations. The most fundamental force was poverty. In a subsistence economy where most people lived perpetually on the edge of starvation, women were particularly vulnerable. They earned less than men for the same work. They were excluded from most lucrative professions, and they had few legal rights to property or inheritance. A woman whose father died might find herself without support. A woman whose husband died might lose her home and livelihood. A woman born to a family too poor to provide a dowry might never marry at all. An unmarried mother faced complete social ostracism, and had virtually no means of supporting herself and a child. These women faced a brutal calculation. They could starve, or they could survive by any means available. Consider the case of a young woman in 14th century London. Her father was a day labourer who died of illness. Her mother struggled to feed 3 children on her earnings as a laundress. At 14, this girl, let us call her Alice, though we do not know her real name, began working as a servant in a merchant's household. The work was gruelling. She rose before dawn and worked until after dark, hauling water, scrubbing floors, emptying chamber pots, tending fires. Her wages were a few pennies a week, plus food and a place to sleep on the kitchen floor. Within months, the merchant began making advances. She tried to refuse, but he was her employer. He controlled her food, her shelter, her wages. He could turn her out onto the streets at any moment, and so she submitted, hoping this would satisfy him and she could continue working. It did not satisfy him. He grew bolder. He demanded she come to his chambers whenever he wanted. He began lending her to business associates as a gesture of hospitality, and he paid her nothing extra for any of this. It was simply expected. After a year, she became pregnant. The merchant immediately dismissed her, calling her a whore and refusing to acknowledge any responsibility. She returned to her mother's house, but her mother could not feed another mouth, especially once the baby arrived. Alice had no options left. She began standing in certain streets known for such things, offering herself to men for a few pennies. It was that or watch her child starve. This story, reconstructed from the types of records that do survive, was tragically common. Poverty created vulnerability. Vulnerability led to exploitation, and exploitation destroyed the few protections women had, leaving prostitution as the only remaining means of survival. Orphans were particularly at risk. Medieval society had no social safety net, no welfare system, no orphanages in the modern sense. Children who lost parents might be taken in by relatives if they were lucky, but many were not lucky. They became street children, beggars, and desperate. Girls reached puberty around age 14 or 15 in medieval times, later than today due to poorer nutrition. But once they did, their ability to trade sex for food, shelter, or coins became apparent. Some were actively recruited by older prostitutes or procurers who offered them food and protection in exchange for entering the trade. The medieval term for a woman who recruited others into prostitution was a bawd, and these women played complex roles. Some were exploitative, taking most of the younger women's earnings and trapping them in cycles of debt. Others offered genuine protection and training, teaching young women how to avoid disease, handle dangerous clients, and save money. One remarkable survival from medieval records is the memoirs of Marjorie Kempe, a 15th century English woman who wrote about her spiritual journey. Though Kempe herself was not a prostitute, her book mentions encounters with women in the trade, and through her scandalized descriptions, we catch glimpses of how these women operated. She describes meeting women in alehouses, women who dressed distinctively, often in bright colours or with particular accessories that signalled their availability. She mentions how these women moved through castle feasts and festivals, how they negotiated with clients, how they faced condemnation from respectable society, but found ways to survive nonetheless. War created another path into prostitution. Medieval Europe was constantly at war, and armies attracted crowds of women known as camp followers. These women served many functions. They cooked, laundered, nursed the wounded, and yes, provided sexual services. Some camp followers were soldiers' wives, respectable women who travelled with armies because medieval campaigns could last years, and women had few options for survival when their men were away. But many were prostitutes, following the money and protection that armies provided. Life as a camp follower was brutal. These women walked or rode behind the army, often for hundreds of miles. They faced hunger, cold, disease, and violence. When armies sacked cities, which was common, these women were often among the victims of the subsequent chaos, yet they persisted, because the alternative, being left alone in a war-torn countryside with no protection, was worse. Some women entered prostitution through deception. Young girls from rural areas might be recruited by travelling merchants or entertainers who promised them positions as servants or seamstresses in distant cities. Once far from home, these girls would discover the true nature of their employment. and with no resources, no connections, and no way to return home, they would be trapped. This form of trafficking existed throughout the medieval period, though it was rarely prosecuted because prostitutes were seen as being without honour anyway, and therefore their consent or lack thereof was legally irrelevant. Religious disruption also created vulnerable populations of women. When convents were closed or fell into poverty, when women who had taken vows found themselves expelled, they entered a world completely unprepared to receive them. They had no work skills beyond prayer and needlework, no family ties, no dowries. Some descended into poverty and prostitution. There is evidence from medieval German territories of former nuns appearing in brothel records, women whose religious houses had been dissolved during various church reforms or political upheavals. Their presence in such records speaks to the desperation of their circumstances. It is also important to note that medieval society drew lines between types of prostitution that modern people might not recognise. There was a hierarchy, with some forms considered more acceptable than others. At the top were high-status courtesans, women who serviced nobility and wealthy merchants. These women were relatively rare, and they occupied a strange social position. They could accumulate wealth, dress well, and live comfortably, yet they remained socially stigmatized and legally vulnerable. Some became mistresses of powerful men, bearing illegitimate children who might be acknowledged and supported, or might be abandoned. Below them were women who worked in taverns and alehouses, either as independent operators or under the protection of the establishment owner. These women had some stability, a regular location, some protection from violence, and a somewhat predictable income. Further down were streetwalkers, women who solicited in public spaces. They were the most vulnerable, most visible, and most likely to face arrest, violence, and disease. At the very bottom were women so desperate they offered themselves for almost nothing, sometimes only for a meal or a place to sleep. These women lived in the most extreme poverty, often homeless, often sick, and often young, either just entering prostitution or near the end of their short lives. The castle environment created its own categories. Some women were semi-permanent residents, servants who supplemented their income with sex work. Others were brought in for special occasions, when important guests visited or when soldiers needed entertainment after a campaign. Still others operated in the shadow of the castle, in the town that grew up around it, in the taverns and market squares where castle personnel mingled with townspeople. Understanding these different pathways into prostitution helps us see these women as individuals responding to specific circumstances, not as a monolithic group of fallen women, which is how medieval moralists portrayed them. But how exactly did prostitution operate in the castle context? How was it organised? Who controlled it? How did women find clients and negotiate services? These practical questions bring us deeper into the hidden economy. Part 3. The hidden economy of castle prostitution. The exchange of sex for money or goods in medieval castles operated according to unwritten rules, social codes that everyone understood but few ever explicitly stated. To understand this hidden economy, we must look at how prostitution was organised, who profited from it, and how women navigated the practical realities of their trade. Castles were not just buildings, they were economic engines. They consumed enormous quantities of food, cloth, metal, leather, and labour. They generated waste that needed hauling. They required constant maintenance and repair. And all of this economic activity created a complex web of exchange. Into this web fitted prostitution, neither fully acknowledged nor fully suppressed, but operating continuously in the background. The most direct form was the simple transaction. A soldier or knight might approach a female servant and offer her coins for sexual access. If she agreed, the transaction would occur in whatever private space could be found. A corner of the barracks, a storage room, the stables, or outside the castle walls. These transactions were typically brief and unromantic. Medieval people had little privacy and less sentimentality about bodily functions. Sex was transactional, even within marriage for many people. So commercial sex was simply a more explicit version of an exchange that characterized much of medieval sexual relations. The payment might be a few pennies, perhaps half a day's wages for a labourer. It might be food, a loaf of bread, some cheese, a cup of wine. It might be protection, a promise to intervene if the woman faced trouble. The currency varied based on what the man had and what the woman needed most, but not all prostitution was this straightforward. Often, it was embedded in other economic relationships. Taverns and alehouses existed in every castle town, and many operated within castle walls themselves. These establishments served multiple functions. They provided food and drink, certainly, but they also served as social centres, gambling houses, and places where business was conducted. Tavern keepers were often women, widows usually who inherited the business from deceased husbands, or single women who managed to accumulate enough capital to establish themselves. Some of these women employed barmaids, and the line between serving drinks and providing sexual services was often deliberately blurred. A tavern owner might hire young, attractive women to serve in her establishment, knowing that their presence would attract male customers who would buy more ale. These barmaids would flirt with customers, sit on laps, allow groping, and in many cases would negotiate private transactions. The tavern owner took a portion of all earnings, sometimes half or more. In exchange, she provided the location, some protection from violence, and occasionally legal representation if the authorities cracked down. This arrangement benefited everyone except the women doing the actual sex work. The tavern owner profited, the castle personnel got entertainment and sexual access. The local authorities could claim the prostitution was happening in a contained, semi-controlled environment rather than on the streets. Some castles had more formalised arrangements. In certain times and places, lords would explicitly license prostitution, not out of moral approval, but out of pragmatic calculation and profit motive. Consider the practice that emerged in some French castles during the 100 Years' War. Lords would authorise certain women to operate as prostitutes for the garrison, and would take a portion of their earnings as a form of taxation. The women received minimal protection. They were not allowed to refuse any member of the garrison, but they were guaranteed a certain income and would not face arrest. This system was exploitative in the extreme, essentially creating sexual slavery under the guise of licensing. Yet for women who had no other options, it offered a form of stability. They would not starve, they would not freeze on the streets, and they had at least the theoretical backing of the Lord's authority against the worst violence. The church officially condemned prostitution, but individual churchmen were often clients or even proprietors. There are records from medieval Rome of priests running brothels. In other locations, monasteries owned properties that they rented to boards for operating brothels, the monasteries profiting from sin while condemning it. This hypocrisy was not lost on medieval people. Satirical literature from the period frequently mocked corrupt clergy, who preached chastity while visiting prostitutes. But the power of the church was such that open criticism was dangerous. So these critiques remained in the realm of humour and allegory. Within castles, chaplains and priests were often aware of prostitution among the castle staff, and their responses varied. Some preached against it, some offered confession and absolution, some were clients themselves. The medieval church taught that even the worst sinner could be forgiven through confession and penance, which created a strange dynamic where sin could be committed repeatedly, confessed repeatedly, and absolved repeatedly. For prostitutes, this meant that religious condemnation was constant, but total exclusion from salvation was not. A woman could attend Mass, could confess, could take communion, even while continuing to sell sex. She was a sinner, certainly, but medieval Christianity emphasized that all people were sinners and that God's mercy was infinite. This theological position created space for prostitutes to remain part of the Christian community, unlike in some other religious traditions where such women would be completely cast out. It was a narrow, uncomfortable space, but it existed. The economics of prostitution varied dramatically based on a woman's status, appearance, youth, and location. A young, attractive woman in a prosperous castle town might earn several times what she could as a servant, allowing her to save money, dress better, and potentially exit the trade if she could accumulate enough capital. An older woman, a woman marked by disease, or a woman in a poor region might earn barely enough to survive, caught in a trap where she had to continue selling sex just to eat, with no possibility of saving or escaping. Some women managed to leverage their earnings into other opportunities. There are records of former prostitutes who accumulated enough money to open their own taverns, to purchase property, to marry men of lower social status who were willing to overlook their past in exchange for their wealth. These were the exceptions, but they existed, and they show that prostitution was not always a permanent state. Some women passed through it, survived it, and moved on to other lives. Others were not so fortunate. Disease was rampant, especially sexually transmitted infections that medieval medicine could not cure. Syphilis would not arrive in Europe until after 1492, but gonorrhea and other infections were common and could lead to chronic pain, infertility, and death. Violence was constant. Women were beaten by clients, by procurers, by authorities. They were raped by men who felt that prostitutes could not be raped because they had already sold their sexual honour. They were robbed because they were seen as having no right to legal protection. And they aged quickly. Medieval life was hard on bodies, and prostitution was harder still. A woman who entered the trade at 15 might be considered old at 25. Her earnings would decline, her options would narrow, and she would face an uncertain future with no savings, no pension, no family support. Some women formed networks of mutual support. Groups of prostitutes would band together, sharing information about dangerous clients, pooling resources when one woman was sick or injured, and providing the social bonds that respectable society denied them. These networks operated in the shadows, invisible to official record keepers but crucial to survival. They were not formal organisations. There were no guilds of prostitutes as there were guilds of craftsmen, but they were real communities nonetheless. Within castles, certain servants might facilitate prostitution without being prostitutes themselves. A laundress might know which women were available and would make introductions for a fee. A stable hand might allow his space to be used for transactions. A guard might look the other way at certain entrances for a portion of the earnings. All of this created a hidden economy, a network of transactions and relationships that operated parallel to the official economy. Money and goods flowed through channels that left almost no documentary trace, but which supported many people beyond just the prostitutes themselves. This underground economy was tacitly accepted because it served too many interests to suppress entirely. Men wanted sexual access. Women needed survival. Entrepreneurs wanted profit. Authorities wanted stability and their own cut of the earnings. Only the prostitutes themselves bore all the risks, the violence, the disease, the social stigma, the legal vulnerability. They were the most exploited participants in a system that exploited them at every level. But they were not passive victims. Within their constrained circumstances, they made choices. They negotiated. They protected themselves as best they could. They found ways to survive that the official chronicles never recorded. Understanding this hidden economy is crucial to understanding castle life more broadly, because the castle was not just a place of knights and nobility, tournaments and feasts. It was also a place where survival was purchased in 100 different ways, some of which history has chosen to remember, and many of which history has chosen to forget. Now let us turn to the question of daily life. What did a prostitute's actual days and nights look like? How did she move through the castle environment? What dangers did she face moment to moment? Part 4. Daily life and survival. The daily reality of a prostitute working in or around a medieval castle was shaped by the rhythm of castle life itself. The changing of guard shifts, the arrival and departure of merchants and travellers, the feast days and holy days, the cycles of the agricultural year that determined who had money and who did not. Let us imagine a woman. We will call her Beatrice. She is 22 years old, which makes her middle-aged by the standards of her profession. She has been working as a prostitute for 6 years, since she was widowed at 16 and found herself with no family support and a small child to feed. Beatrice wakes before dawn in a small room she shares with 2 other women in a building just outside the castle walls. The room is cold. Medieval buildings had poor insulation and only a small brazier for heat that went out during the night. She rises and dresses in the near dark, pulling on several layers of worn wool clothing. Medieval clothing was expensive, even for prostitutes, and most people owned only a few garments that they wore repeatedly. Beatrice's clothing marks her status. She cannot afford the fine fabrics of respectable women, but she also cannot appear too ragged, or she would attract no clients. Her dress is patched but clean, dyed a rusty red that helps her stand out. Red and yellow were colours often associated with prostitutes in medieval sumptuary laws, regulations that dictated what colours and fabrics different social classes could wear. Her first task is to check on her child, a girl of 6 who sleeps in a corner. The child will spend the day with an older woman who watches several prostitutes' children for a small fee. This arrangement is precarious, but it is all Beatrice can manage. She kisses her daughter's forehead and leaves before the child wakes, not wanting to answer questions about where she is, going. The castle town is just stirring. Beatrice walks through muddy streets. Medieval urban sanitation was poor, and streets were often filled with animal waste, garbage, and human refuse. She heads toward the tavern where she works most days, a low building with a crude sign showing a boar's head. The tavern keeper, a sharp-faced woman named Agnes, is already preparing for the day. Agnes is a widow who owns this establishment, and she runs a tight operation. She employs 3 women, including Beatrice, all of them serving drinks, all of them expected to entertain male customers, and all of them giving Agnes half of any money they earn from private services. Beatrice begins her work by hauling water from the well, filling the large barrels that will be needed for brewing ale and for customers who want to wash. Medieval ale was the primary beverage, safer than water, which was often contaminated. Making and serving ale was women's work, and tavern keepers brewed constantly. As morning progresses, customers begin arriving, castle guards ending their night shifts, merchants setting up in the market, labourers looking for work, craftsmen taking a break from their workshops. Beatrice moves among them, carrying cups of ale, exchanging banter, allowing a certain amount of familiar touching. She has learned to read men, to distinguish between those who are merely lonely and want conversation, those who are looking for sex, and those who might become violent. The first proposition comes mid-morning from a soldier she recognises. He has been stationed at the castle for months and is a regular customer. He offers her 3 pennies, a reasonable price. She agrees and leads him to a room in the back of the tavern that Agnes rents out for such purposes. The transaction takes perhaps 10 minutes. Medieval sex was generally quick and unadorned. Beatrice has learned to make it as fast as possible, to minimise her discomfort and risk while still giving the customer enough satisfaction that he will return. She takes the coins, gives half to Agnes as required, and returns to serving ale. This pattern repeats several times throughout the day. Between transactions, Beatrice serves drinks, listens to gossip, picks up information about which nobles are visiting the castle and whether they might be potential clients, and dodges the most aggressive grabbing hands. By medieval standards, Beatrice is relatively successful in her profession. She's still young enough to attract clients. She works out of a tavern rather than the streets, which gives her some protection. She has not yet contracted any serious disease, though she lives in constant fear of it, and she has managed to keep her child fed and sheltered, but the precariousness of her situation is constant. If she becomes ill and cannot work, she will have no income. If Agnes decides to replace her with a younger woman, she will lose her primary source of clients. If the local authorities decide to crack down on prostitution, she could be arrested, branded, or exiled. The afternoon brings a different kind of customer. A travelling merchant arrives at the tavern, clearly wealthy from his clothing and the purse at his belt. He orders the best ale, demands a private room, and points at Beatrice. Agnes intervenes, negotiating a higher price given the man's evident wealth. He agrees to pay 10 pennies, a significant sum. But Beatrice feels uneasy. She does not know this man. He is not a regular, and there is something in his manner that frightens her. She has no choice but to comply. To refuse would mean angering Agnes, losing income, and possibly being turned out of the tavern entirely. She leads the merchant to the room. What follows is more violent than usual. The merchant is rough, unconcerned with her pain, treating her as a purchased object rather than a human being. He slaps her when she makes a sound. He leaves bruises. When it's over, he tosses the coins on the floor and walks out without a word. Beatrice sits in the small room for several minutes, waiting for her hands to stop shaking, swallowing her tears because she cannot afford to appear too upset when she returns to the tavern floor. She collects the coins, checks herself for serious injury, and goes back to work. This is the reality of prostitution that romantic notions of courtesans and wenches obscure. It was work performed under threat of violence with no legal protection, by women who had no alternative means of survival. The veneer of consent was paper-thin, maintained only by the economic coercion that left women with the choice of selling sex or starving. As evening approaches, the tavern grows more crowded and more dangerous. Men who have been drinking all day become belligerent. fights break out. Agnes employs a large man as a bouncer of sorts, but he is only one person and cannot stop all violence. Beatrice has learned to position herself near exits. She has learned to identify which men are merely drunk and which are dangerous. She has learned to smile and deflect and disappear when necessary. These survival skills are not taught. They're acquired through experience, through near misses, through watching what happens to women who do not learn them quickly enough. By the time night falls, Beatrice has earned perhaps 20 pennies, of which she keeps 10 after Agnes takes her share. This is actually a good day. Some days she earns much less, especially in winter when fewer travellers come through and the castle garrison has less money. She collects her daughter from the childminder, paying 2 pennies for the day's care, and returns to her room. The child is hungry. Beatrice buys bread and cheese from a vendor. Another 2 pennies. She has 8 pennies left from a day's work, enough to pay her share of the room rent and save a small amount. At this rate, she might eventually save enough to stop working, to perhaps remarry, or open some small business. But the rate of savings is slow, and the risk of catastrophe is high. An injury, an illness, a pregnancy, a violent client, any of these could erase months of careful saving in an instant. As Beatrice settles her daughter to sleep, she thinks about the future. She's only 22, but she knows her desirability will not last much longer. She has perhaps 3 more years of relatively steady work before age, and where make her less attractive to clients? What will she do then? This is the question that haunts all medieval prostitutes. The lucky ones find a way out: marriage, a different trade, the protection of a long-term patron. The unlucky ones descend into deeper poverty, older, sicker, more desperate, until they disappear from history entirely, unmourned and unremembered. Beatrice's story is not exceptional. It is typical. Thousands of women lived versions of it across medieval Europe, in castle towns, in cities, in roadside taverns. They woke each day uncertain whether they would survive it. They navigated violence and disease and exploitation. They raised children or mourned children lost. They saved money or lost money. They grew older knowing that old age meant destitution, and history barely noticed them, except to condemn them. The daily reality of medieval prostitution was exhausting, dangerous, and relentless. It was not the romanticised image of pretty wenches entertaining knights. It was poor women selling the only commodity they possessed to men who had the economic and physical power to take it without payment if they chose. Understanding this daily reality helps us comprehend why medieval prostitutes were not simply immoral women, but survivors of a social system that offered them almost no legitimate paths to economic survival. Their choices were constrained to the point where calling them choices at all requires examination. But what happened when things went wrong? When women became pregnant, or ill, or old? When authorities decided to crack down? When violence escalated beyond even the normal background level? These questions lead us to examine the darker aspects of an already dark reality. Part 5. Violence, disease, and the threat of law. If daily life for medieval prostitutes was difficult, the catastrophes that could befall them were devastating. And these catastrophes were not rare exceptions. They were common, predictable, and built into the very structure of prostitution in a society that despised the women it exploited. Violence against prostitutes was endemic and largely unpunished. Medieval law provided little protection to any woman, but prostitutes, having lost their sexual honour, were considered to have lost their right to legal protection against sexual violence as well. The logic, twisted as it was, went like this. Rape was a crime against honour and property. A virgin's value was in her marriageability, which depended on her virginity. A wife's value was in ensuring her husband's children were actually his. But a prostitute had no honour to lose and no property rights to her own body. Therefore, by the reasoning of many medieval jurists, a prostitute could not be raped, because she had already consented to sexual access by entering the profession. This legal position created open season for violence against prostitutes. Men could beat them, rape them, and rob them with minimal fear of prosecution. If a prostitute tried to bring charges, she would likely be laughed out of court, or worse, charged with wasting the court's time or with being a prostitute in the first place. The records that survive show this pattern again and again. A prostitute is found dead, and the investigation is cursory or non-existent. A prostitute reports being robbed, and she is ignored or arrested. A a prostitute is beaten severely, and authorities do nothing unless her injuries are so extreme that she dies and the body creates a public nuisance. Some of the worst violence came from groups of men. Medieval cities and castles had problems with gangs of young men, often apprentices or younger sons of nobility, who roamed the streets at night engaging in violence and disorder. Prostitutes were frequent targets. There are records from medieval Florence of groups of young men who would attack prostitutes, gang raping them, robbing them, sometimes murdering them, as a form of entertainment. The authorities occasionally prosecuted these crimes, but punishments were light and repeat offences were common. In castle environments, soldiers were frequent perpetrators of violence. Military culture valorized masculine aggression and sexual conquest. Soldiers far from home, living with the psychological effects of medieval warfare and subject to brutal discipline themselves, often took out their frustrations on the most vulnerable targets available, and prostitutes were among the most vulnerable. The aftermath of military campaigns was particularly dangerous. When armies returned to castles after months of fighting, rape and assault of prostitutes and lower-class women generally spiked. These crimes were rarely prosecuted because soldiers were valuable to their lords and prostitutes were not. Disease was the other great catastrophe that haunted prostitutes. Sexually transmitted infections were common and completely misunderstood by medieval medicine. Gonorrhea, which medieval people called the burning, or simply the sickness, caused painful urination, discharge, and could lead to pelvic inflammatory disease in women, causing chronic pain and infertility. There was no effective treatment. Medieval physicians might prescribe herbal remedies or bloodletting, but these did nothing to cure bacterial infections. Other infections caused similar symptoms and similar suffering. Women worked while sick because they had no choice. They could not afford to stop earning, and their sickness often made them desperate enough to accept lower prices and more dangerous clients, accelerating the cycle of poverty and disease. Skin conditions were also common, including scabies and lice, which were universal in medieval populations but particularly problematic for women who had intimate physical contact with many men. These conditions were not life-threatening but were uncomfortable and stigmatizing. Pregnancy was both a risk and a catastrophe. Medieval contraception was unreliable at best. Women used various methods: herbal pessaries, withdrawal, barriers made of cloth or animal bladders, but none were particularly effective. When pregnancy occurred, prostitutes faced impossible choices. Childbirth itself was extremely dangerous in medieval times. Maternal mortality was high even for wealthy women with access to midwives. For poor prostitutes, the risks were higher still. If a woman survived childbirth, she faced the problem of supporting a child while continuing to work as a prostitute. Some managed it through the arrangement Beatrice used, paying other women to watch children during working hours. Others abandoned children at churches or monasteries, hoping they would be taken in. Medieval foundling hospitals existed in some cities, but they were often overcrowded and had high infant mortality rates. Abortion and infanticide were both practiced, though both were illegal and condemned by the church. Evidence suggests that infanticide was more common than abortion, simply because abortion methods were dangerous and unreliable. Women who were discovered to have killed infants faced execution, but desperation drove some to take the risk anyway. The legal system itself was a constant threat to prostitutes. Medieval law regarding prostitution varied widely by time and place, but it was always oppressive and often contradictory. Some cities licensed and regulated prostitution. They would designate certain areas as red light districts, register prostitutes, and collect taxes from them. In exchange, these women received minimal protection and were supposed to be left alone to work. But even in these regulated systems, authorities could and did raid brothels, arrest women, and impose fines whenever they needed money or wanted to appear morally righteous. Other jurisdictions attempted to suppress prostitution entirely. Laws would criminalize soliciting, penalize women found working as prostitutes, and sometimes penalize clients as well, though client penalties were rarely enforced. The punishments for prostitution range from fines to public humiliation to physical mutilation to exile to death. The severity depended on local law, the particular circumstances, and often on whether authorities were feeling particularly moralistic at the moment. Public humiliation punishments were common. A woman might be forced to walk through town wearing a distinctive hat or garment that marked her as a prostitute. While townspeople jeered and threw garbage, she might be placed in the stocks or pillory for hours or days, exposed to weather and public abuse. She might be whipped publicly in the town square. These punishments served multiple functions. They enforced social norms by punishing visible deviation. They entertained the populace. Public punishments were spectacles that drew crowds, and they terrorized other prostitutes into compliance or hiding. Physical mutilation was less common but not rare. Some jurisdictions mandated that prostitutes be branded on the face or shoulder, permanently marking them as dishonorable. Others cut off ears or noses, disfiguring women as a warning to others. These mutilations effectively ended any possibility of a woman leaving prostitution. She was now visibly marked as a prostitute for life, unable to marry, unable to work in respectable trades, unable to move to a new place and start over. The mutilation itself was the permanent sentence, forcing her to continue in prostitution until age or disease killed her. Exile was common in cities. Authorities would round up prostitutes and forcibly expel them, sometimes to specific areas outside city walls, sometimes with orders never to return. These expulsions served to remove the visible presence of prostitution without actually addressing the economic conditions that created it. The exiled women would often return eventually out of desperation, risking harsher punishment if caught. Death sentences for prostitution alone were relatively rare in most of medieval Europe, but they occurred. More commonly, prostitutes would be executed for other crimes: theft, infanticide, practicing magic or witchcraft. Charges that were easier to prove and carried mandatory death sentences. The combination of violence, disease, pregnancy risk, and legal persecution meant that life expectancy for medieval prostitutes was significantly lower than for other women of their social class. Most women working as prostitutes could expect to live only into their 30s if they were lucky, with many dying younger from violence, disease, childbirth complications, or the accumulated effects of poverty and malnutrition. Yet despite all these dangers, prostitution persisted. Women continued to enter the profession because the alternatives were often worse: starvation, homelessness, death from exposure. These were the choices that made even the terrifying risks of prostitution seem preferable, and some women found ways to survive, and even, occasionally, to escape. The networks of mutual aid among prostitutes, the occasional sympathetic authority figure, the rare opportunity to marry or establish a small business. These narrow paths to survival existed, and some women found them, but for every woman who escaped, many more did not. They disappeared into unmarked graves, their names forgotten, their stories untold, their lives reduced to entries in arrest records and court documents that portray them only as criminals and sinners. Understanding the violence, disease, and legal persecution that medieval prostitutes faced is essential to understanding their lives completely. They were not simply making choices in a neutral market economy. They were navigating a system of exploitation that profited from their bodies, enjoyed their services, and then punished them for providing those services. The hypocrisy was not lost on medieval people themselves. Satirical literature and popular songs often mocked the men who used prostitutes and then condemned them, who claimed moral superiority while being the primary drivers of demand. But mockery did not change the system, and prostitutes continued to bear the weight of society's contradictions. Now we must examine how prostitution fit into the specifically military culture of castles, because castles were above all military installations, and the relationship between soldiers and prostitutes was central to castle life. Part 6. Soldiers, Sieges, and Military Culture. The castle was fundamentally a military structure. A medieval military culture shaped every aspect of life within its walls, including the nature and extent of prostitution. To understand how prostitutes survived in the castle environment, we must understand the military world they navigated. Medieval armies were brutal institutions. Soldiers were often recruited from the lowest social classes: landless men, younger sons with no inheritance. Criminals offered pardons in exchange for service, and mercenaries from across Europe who fought for whoever paid them. These men lived with violence as their daily reality. Training for medieval combat was harsh. Men learned to fight with swords, spears, axes, and bows, weapons designed to kill. They learned to wear heavy armour in all weather. They learned to obey orders instantly and to show no mercy to enemies, and they learned that their lives were cheap, that they could be killed at any moment and would be quickly replaced. This culture of violence and disposability created soldiers who viewed the world through a lens of power and domination. Women of lower social status were not people to be respected. They were resources to be used, and prostitutes were the most available resource. When armies went on campaign, they attracted massive followings of camp followers, and among these followers were always prostitutes. A large medieval army might have thousands of women following it, some as wives, some as servants, some as merchants, and many as prostitutes. These women walked or rode behind the army as it marched, covering perhaps 10 to 20 miles a day over rough terrain. They slept in the open or in makeshift camps. They ate whatever food they could obtain or afford, and they risked violence not only from the enemy but from the soldiers they serviced. When an army besieged a castle, the prostitutes would set up camp nearby, establishing temporary brothels in tents or commandeered buildings. Soldiers with pay would visit these women for sex, alcohol, gambling, and social interaction. For men facing potential death, these spaces offered brief respites from fear and boredom. The siege itself was a terrifying environment. Medieval sieges could last months. Armies would surround a castle, cutting off supplies, and wait for the defenders to surrender from starvation. Alternatively, they would attempt to breach the walls through mining, bombardment with catapults and trebuchets, or direct assault with siege towers and ladders. During sieges, disease often killed more people than combat. Armies camped in unsanitary conditions with inadequate food and clean water. Typhus, dysentery, and other epidemic diseases swept through military camps regularly. Prostitutes living in these camps had no protection from disease, and their malnutrition and exposure made them particularly vulnerable. If the siege succeeded and the castle fell, what followed was often horrific. Medieval military custom generally held that a castle that refused to surrender and was taken by storm could be sacked, meaning soldiers were given permission to loot, rape, and kill for a specified period. During these sacks, all women in the castle and surrounding areas were at risk, but prostitutes, already stigmatized and unprotected, were among the most vulnerable. They would be raped by multiple soldiers, beaten, robbed, and sometimes murdered. If they survived, they would emerge traumatized and destitute, all their meager possessions stolen, their bodies injured, their ability to continue working compromised. Some prostitutes were taken as prisoners by victorious armies, forced to continue serving the soldiers who had conquered their castle. These women became informal slaves. Though medieval law did not recognize sexual slavery as a legal category, they would be kept with the army until they were no longer useful, either because they aged, became ill, became pregnant, or simply because the soldiers tired of them. Then they would be abandoned wherever the army happened to be, often hundreds of miles from their homes, with no resources and no way to return. Within castles during peacetime, the relationship between soldiers and prostitutes was more stable, but still fundamentally exploitative. Garrison soldiers were paid, though often irregularly, and they had few ways to spend their money. Drinking and sex were the primary entertainments available. Castle lords were pragmatic about soldier morale. They understood that men kept in close quarters under military discipline needed outlets for aggression and sexual desire. Tolerating prostitution in castle towns or even within castle walls served this function, keeping soldiers satisfied enough that they were less likely to desert or rebel. Some lords actively facilitated prostitution for their garrisons. They would allow taverns inside castle walls or immediately adjacent. They would ensure that prostitutes had access to soldiers during off-duty hours. They would look the other way when soldiers brought women into the barracks. This tolerance had limits, though. Lords did not want prostitution to interfere with military discipline or readiness. If prostitutes were blamed for disease outbreaks, they might be expelled. If gambling and drinking associated with brothels led to fights that disrupted order, they might be cracked down on. If a particular woman was seen as causing conflict among soldiers, she might be banished. The relationship between individual soldiers and prostitutes varied. Some men were regular clients of particular women, forming relationships that, while still commercial, had elements of human connection. These men might protect their women from other soldiers, might pay more generously, might even form emotional attachments. Other soldiers treated prostitutes with contempt and violence, viewing them as deserving of whatever treatment they received. These men would beat women, refuse to pay, and commit rape that no one would acknowledge as rape because the victim was a prostitute. Knights and nobles also used prostitutes, despite the ideology of chivalry that supposedly governed noble behaviour. Chivalry applied only to noblewomen, and even then, primarily to married noblewomen whose honour was tied to their husband's honour. Lower-class women, and certainly prostitutes, were outside the bounds of chivalric protection. Young knights in training, squires and pages living in castles, were often initiated into sexuality through prostitutes. This was seen as normal and even appropriate, preferable to young men pursuing noblewomen, which could create political complications. Older knights, whether married or not, also patronised prostitutes. Medieval marriage among nobility was a political and economic arrangement, not primarily a romantic one. Love and sexual attraction were not expected components of marriage, so knights would seek sexual variety with prostitutes while maintaining their marriages for dynastic purposes. The presence of prostitutes in military culture was so normalised that medieval literature includes numerous references to it. Poems, songs and stories mention soldiers, women, camp followers, and tavern wenches as standard parts of military life. These references are usually casual, neither condemning nor celebrating, simply acknowledging a reality everyone understood. What this tells us is that prostitution was not a fringe or hidden aspect of medieval military culture. It was central to it. The functioning of medieval armies, the maintenance of castle garrisons, and the management of soldier morale all depended in part on the availability of women's bodies for sexual use. And yet the women who provided this essential service received no gratitude, no protection, no recognition. They were used and then discarded, exploited and then blamed for their exploitation, necessary and yet despised. The military context also shaped the particular dangers prostitutes faced. Soldiers were trained in violence and often brutalized by their experiences. They carried weapons constantly. They were accustomed to taking what they wanted by force, and they were part of a command structure that protected them from consequences for violence against lower-class women. All of this meant that prostitutes serving military populations faced elevated risks of violence, and had even less recourse to justice than prostitutes in civilian contexts. A woman beaten by a soldier had virtually no chance of obtaining justice through official channels. The military protected its own, and a prostitute's testimony was worthless against a soldier's word. Yet despite all these dangers, women continued to follow armies and service garrisons. The economic calculation remained brutally simple. This was how they survived. And in the absence of any other options, they made the choice to stay alive by any means available. Understanding the military dimension of castle prostitution helps us see how deeply embedded sexual exploitation was in medieval warfare and castle life. It was not an unfortunate side effect, it was part of the system. Medieval military culture depended on having access to women's bodies, and society organised itself to ensure that access, while simultaneously condemning the women who provided it. This brings us to an important question about the role of the Church, which officially condemned prostitution, but was deeply involved in the actual practice and management of it. Part 7. The Church, Sin, and Redemption. The medieval Church's relationship with prostitution was profoundly contradictory. On one hand, Church doctrine condemned all sex outside marriage as sinful, and prostitution was therefore clearly sinful. On the other hand, Church authorities often tolerated or even facilitated prostitution as a necessary evil that protected respectable women and prevented worse sins. This contradiction played out in theology, in law, in practice, and in the lives of individual prostitutes trying to navigate a religious world that simultaneously condemned and utilised them. Christian theology inherited from St. Augustine the concept of prostitution as a necessary evil. Augustine, writing in the 4th and 5th centuries, argued that prostitution prevented greater evils like adultery and rape. He compared prostitutes to sewers in a palace, disgusting but necessary for carrying away filth. Without sewers, the palace would be uninhabitable. Without prostitutes, men's lust would overflow into worse sins. This theological position became influential throughout the medieval period. It provided justification for tolerating prostitution even while condemning it. Prostitutes served a social function. They absorbed male lust that might otherwise threaten social order. Thomas Aquinas, the most important medieval theologian, elaborated on this position in the 13th century. He argued that prostitution should be tolerated by secular authorities because attempting to suppress it entirely would lead to worse consequences. Men would rape respectable women, commit adultery, or engage in sodomy, all sins considered worse than simple fornication with prostitutes. This pragmatic theological approach meant that the Church never attempted to eliminate prostitution through religious authority, even though it had the power to do so through excommunication and other spiritual penalties. Instead, the Church focused on limiting prostitution's visibility and on offering prostitutes paths to redemption. The redemption narrative was central to how the Church approached prostitutes. Christianity taught that all sinners could be saved through repentance. Mary Magdalene, identified in medieval tradition as a reformed prostitute, was held up as a model of sin and redemption. This meant that prostitutes were not permanently damned. They could confess their sins, receive absolution, and be welcomed back into the Christian community. Some prostitutes confessed regularly, attended Mass, and participated in religious life while continuing to work, creating a cycle of sin, confession, and temporary forgiveness. The Church also established institutions specifically for reforming prostitutes. These were called Magdalene houses or convertite convents, religious houses where prostitutes could retreat from their former lives and live under religious discipline. Entry into these institutions usually required genuine repentance, demonstrated through confession and the abandonment of former associates. Once inside, women would live much like nuns, following a religious rule, performing labour like spinning or sewing, attending religious services, and supposedly preparing for a life of chastity. The reality of these institutions was complex. For some women, they offered genuine escape from prostitution, a safe place to live, regular food, and the possibility of spiritual and social rehabilitation. For others, they were little better than prisons, places where women were confined against their will, forced to perform labour that benefited the Church, and subjected to harsh discipline for any infractions. Women who successfully completed time in convertite houses might be found respectable marriages, typically to widowers or older men willing to overlook their past, or they might be given dowries to enter convents as full nuns, or they might be set up in some small business like washing or sewing, but the success rate was limited. Many women left or were expelled from these houses. Some returned to prostitution because they saw no other way to survive. Others found that their past as prostitutes made it impossible to establish respectable lives, even with the Church's support. The Church's approach to prostitution was also deeply gendered. Prostitutes were seen as sinful women who tempted men. The men who used prostitutes were certainly sinning, but their sin was viewed as less severe and more understandable. Men had natural lusts that needed outlets. Women who provided those outlets bore the greater moral responsibility. This double standard appeared in penitential literature, manuals that prescribed specific penances for specific sins. The penances for prostitutes were generally harsher than the penances for their clients. A prostitute might be required to fast for years, while a man who visited prostitutes might fast for months or even weeks. The theological justification was that prostitutes were deliberately choosing to sin as a livelihood, while men were succumbing to momentary weakness. This reasoning ignored the economic coercion that drove women into prostitution, but medieval theology was more concerned with sin than with social conditions. Individual clergy had widely varying attitudes toward prostitutes. Some priests refused to give communion to known prostitutes, treating them as public sinners unworthy of the sacraments until they repented. Other priests were more compassionate, offering confession and spiritual counsel even to women who continued working. And of course, many clergy were clients themselves. Despite vows of celibacy, medieval clergy at all levels regularly broke those vows. Priests kept concubines, bishops fathered children, monks visited brothels, and some clergy not only used prostitutes, but profited from prostitution by owning or licensing brothels. This clerical hypocrisy was widely known and frequently satirized in medieval literature. Stories and poems mocked priests who preached chastity while keeping mistresses, or who condemned prostitution while collecting rent from brothels. These satirical works suggest that ordinary people recognized the contradictions even if they could not openly challenge them. The Church's legal jurisdiction over moral offences meant that prostitutes often faced church courts as well as secular courts. Church courts could charge prostitutes with fornication, which was a sin under church law even if it was tolerated by secular authorities. Punishments from church courts typically involved public penance, walking through the church or town in bare feet, carrying a candle, standing outside the church during Mass for a period of time, or performing other acts designed to humiliate and demonstrate repentance. These church-mandated penances served the same function as secular public humiliation punishments. They reinforced social norms, provided public entertainment, and terrorized other prostitutes into submission or hiding. Religious festivals created particular complications for prostitutes. During Lent, the 40 days before Easter, all sexual activity was supposed to cease, even within marriage. Prostitution during Lent was considered especially sinful, and authorities sometimes cracked down more harshly during this period. Yet Lent was also a time when people travelled to cities for religious observances, increasing the transient male population and thus the demand for prostitutes. So even during the most religiously strict period of the year, prostitution continued, though perhaps more discreetly. Other religious festivals could be times of increased business for prostitutes. When pilgrims travelled to shrines, when nobles gathered for religious celebrations, when church councils met in cities, all of these events brought crowds of men with money and created demand for commercial sex. The Church's position on prostitution reveals the deep contradictions at the heart of medieval Christianity's approach to sexuality and sin. The Church condemned prostitution theologically while tolerating it practically. It punished prostitutes while profiting from prostitution. It offered redemption while maintaining conditions that made prostitution necessary for many women's survival. For prostitutes themselves, the Church was simultaneously a source of condemnation, a path to possible redemption, and often another exploiter. They had to navigate religious requirements and penalties while trying to survive in a profession that religion defined as gravely sinful. Some prostitutes were genuinely devout, attending Mass when permitted, saying prayers, wearing religious medals. They sought to maintain their connection to God even while engaging in what they knew the Church defined as sin. This speaks to the human need for spiritual meaning, and to the complexity of medieval religious life, which could accommodate sinners even while condemning their sins. Others were bitter about the Church's hypocrisy, resentful of clergy who used their services while condemning them from the pulpit. These women saw through the contradictions and developed a more cynical or hostile relationship with institutional religion, and some tried to use the Church's redemption narrative strategically, entering convertite houses when they could no longer work as prostitutes due to age or illness, seeking to exchange their labour and repentance for security in their final years. The Church's role in managing prostitution was thus central to the entire system. It provided theological justification for tolerance, it offered mechanisms for individual redemption, and it participated actively in the regulation and exploitation of prostitutes while maintaining its moral condemnation of them. Understanding this religious dimension is crucial, because medieval people understood their world primarily through religion. Sin, redemption, divine judgment, and salvation were not abstract concepts. They were real forces that shaped daily life. Prostitutes lived in a religious world that told them they were damned, but also that they could be saved, and navigating that contradiction was part of their daily survival. Now we turn to the question of what happened to these women as they aged, because aging in this profession meant losing the ability to earn a living, and the consequences were often tragic. Part 8. Aging, Illness and Endings. Medieval life was short for everyone, but for prostitutes, youth was everything, and its loss meant catastrophe. Understanding how prostitutes aged out of their profession reveals perhaps the cruelest aspect of an already cruel system. A woman entering prostitution at 15 might have 10 to 15 years of relatively steady work ahead of her if she was fortunate. If she was beautiful, careful, and lucky enough to avoid serious disease or disfiguring violence, she might continue longer. But by her late 20s or early 30s, she would find her earnings declining as younger women attracted more clients. The medieval standard of beauty strongly favoured youth. Women were considered most desirable in their teens. By 25, a woman was seen as aging. By 30, she was old. This meant that prostitutes had a narrow window of maximum earning potential, and if they had not managed to save money or find an alternative during that window, they faced destitution in their later years. but saving money was almost impossible. The economic pressure was constant. There was always rent to pay, food to buy, clothing to replace, bribes to authorities, payments to pimps or brothel keepers, and the temptation to spend money on small comforts, better food, warmer clothing, some ale to numb the pain, was strong for women whose daily lives were so harsh. Some women tried to transition into other roles within the sex trade. An aging prostitute might become a board, recruiting younger women and taking a portion of their earnings. This required some capital to establish a place for women to work and some connections to protect the operation from authorities. Women who successfully made this transition could maintain their income even as their own desirability faded. But becoming a board meant exploiting other women in the same way she had been exploited. It meant recruiting desperate girls and trapping them in cycles of debt. It meant negotiating with violent men and corrupt authorities. It was survival. But it came at a moral cost that some women were unwilling or unable to pay. Other women tried to use their accumulated knowledge to become midwives or healers. Prostitutes often gained practical knowledge of women's bodies, pregnancy, contraception, and childbirth through their own experiences and those of other women in the trade. This knowledge could be valuable in communities that had limited access to trained medical practitioners. But the stigma of prostitution followed women into any new profession. A woman known to have been a prostitute might not be trusted as a midwife, especially since midwives were expected to be morally upright women who could testify about whether births were legitimate. The taint of sexual immorality made it difficult to gain the respect necessary for this role. Some women found protection through relationships with individual men. A prostitute who had been a regular for a particular client might convince him to set her up in a small business, a tavern, a washing establishment, a small shop. Or she might become his permanent mistress. Still not a wife, but with some security and support. These arrangements were precarious. The man could withdraw his support at any time. He might die and leave her with nothing if he had not made legal provisions for her. His family might object to his association with a former prostitute and pressure him to end it. But still, such arrangements offered more security than continuing to work on the streets as one's desirability declined. Marriage was theoretically possible but rarely happened. A widower or an older man with few prospects might be willing to marry a former prostitute, especially if she had saved some money that could serve as a dowry. But most men wanted young virgin brides or respectable widows, not women whose sexual history was public knowledge. Some prostitutes ended their lives in religious houses. If they could demonstrate genuine repentance and had some connection to the church or some modest gift to offer, they might be accepted into a converted house, or even a regular convent as a lay sister. This option became more attractive as women aged and faced increasing poverty and danger. But not all women could access these options. Many aged prostitutes simply continued working at decreasing prices for increasingly dangerous clients, descending into deeper poverty and desperation until disease, violence, or exposure killed them. Illness was the companion of aging. Women who had worked for years in prostitution carried accumulated damage, injuries from violence, chronic effects of sexually transmitted infections, exhaustion from malnutrition, and overwork. Their bodies broke down faster than those of women who had lived easier lives. Medieval medicine could do little for most of these conditions. Chronic pain was treated with alcohol or herbal remedies of limited effectiveness. Infections were allowed to run their course. Injuries were set poorly or not at all. Women suffered and worked through their suffering because stopping work meant starvation. Mental and emotional damage was also profound, though medieval people had no vocabulary for trauma as we understand it. Women who had experienced repeated violence, sexual abuse, exploitation, and social rejection for years carried psychological wounds that manifested in depression, anxiety, and various stress-related illnesses. Some women turned to alcohol or other substances to cope. Medieval Europe had limited drugs compared to later periods, but alcohol was readily available and functioned as a form of self-medication. Women who developed dependencies on alcohol found themselves in a new trap, needing money to feed their addiction, which meant continuing to work even as their health deteriorated. The endings of individual. Women's lives are mostly lost to history. They died in ditches, in rented rooms, in hospitals for the poor if such existed in their city. They were buried in unmarked graves or in mass graves for paupers. Sometimes their bodies were not buried at all, simply removed from wherever they had collapsed and disposed of with minimal ceremony. We have occasional glimpses in records. A coroner's report noting a woman's body found in an alley, identified as a prostitute, with no investigation of her death. A hospital record listing a woman admitted in the final stages of illness, her occupation noted as meretrix, prostitute, with no further information about her life. A parish burial record with simply a first name and the notation sinner or fallen woman. These fragmentary records are all that remain of lives that were full and complex, lives that included love and hope, friendship and betrayal, courage and despair. But medieval record keepers had no interest in preserving these women's humanity, so they reduced them to categories and moved on. Yet there were exceptions. Some women did escape, did survive, did build different lives. We know this because occasionally their stories were remarkable enough to be recorded. There are accounts of former prostitutes who became wealthy merchants' wives, who founded hospitals or charitable institutions, who entered convents and became noted for their piety. These stories were recorded specifically because they fit the medieval narrative of sin and redemption, but they also prove that escape was possible, if rare. The most famous example is Mary of Egypt, a legendary figure who became a popular saint in medieval Christianity. According to her story, she lived as a prostitute in Alexandria before experiencing a religious conversion, fleeing to the desert, and living as a hermit for decades. Her story was held up as proof that even the worst sinners could be redeemed. But Mary of Egypt was a legend, not a historical figure in any verifiable sense. Real women's stories of redemption were more mundane, and far rarer than the frequency of the legend's retelling might suggest. Most women who entered prostitution did not escape. They worked for as long as their bodies held out. They aged prematurely, and they died young. Their lives were short, hard, and almost completely unremembered. The system that exploited them ground on without pause. When one woman died or aged out, another desperate woman or girl took her place. The cycle continued across generations and centuries because the underlying conditions, women's economic vulnerability, male sexual entitlement, social inequality, and the absence of alternatives, remained unchanged. Understanding these endings is important, because they reveal the ultimate cruelty of medieval prostitution. It was not just that women were exploited during their working years, it was that the exploitation was structured to prevent them from ever escaping. The system consumed women's youth and health and beauty, and then cast them aside with nothing. This brings us to the final questions of this exploration. How did society view these women, and what does their hidden history tell us about medieval life more broadly? Part 9. Social perception and hidden histories. How did medieval society actually view prostitutes? The answer is complex. Because official condemnation coexisted with practical tolerance, theoretical disgust coexisted with everyday acceptance, and moral judgment coexisted with economic dependence. In sermons and moral literature, prostitutes were consistently portrayed as dangerous sinners. They were daughters of Eve who led men into temptation. They were agents of the devil who corrupted virtuous men. They were pollution that contaminated the social body. This rhetoric was harsh and unrelenting. But in daily life, attitudes were more nuanced. Ordinary people distinguished between respectable women and prostitutes, certainly, but they also recognized prostitutes as human beings with whom they shared communities. A woman known to be a prostitute might still be greeted in the market, might have friends among other poor women, might attend church, might be treated with some measure of ordinary human courtesy. This does not mean medieval society was tolerant or kind to prostitutes. The stigma was real and powerful, but it means that attitudes varied by individual, by context, and by circumstance. Some people were viciously cruel to prostitutes, others were indifferent, a few were compassionate, most were some combination of all three depending on the situation. Medieval law tried to regulate prostitutes' visibility through sumptuary regulations and zoning laws. In many cities, prostitutes were required to wear specific clothing that marked their profession. Yellow hoods, striped cloaks, particular types of sleeves. This served to make their status visible, and to protect respectable women from being mistaken for prostitutes. Prostitutes were also restricted in where they could live and work. Many cities designated specific streets or districts as red light zones, areas where prostitution was openly tolerated. Prostitutes found outside these zones could be arrested and punished. These regulations reveal society's contradictory attitude. Prostitution was condemned as sinful, but it was also contained and managed rather than eliminated. Society wanted prostitutes to exist, but wanted them to be easily identifiable and spatially segregated from respectable neighbourhoods. The spatial segregation of prostitution created invisible economies that historians are only beginning to understand. Red light districts developed their own internal social structures, hierarchies among prostitutes, relationships with landlords and tavern keepers, networks of mutual aid, and informal systems of justice when official justice was unavailable. These districts were not simply places of vice. They were communities where poor women lived and worked. They had their own social norms, codes of behaviour about how to treat clients, how to handle conflicts, how to protect one another. They had their own economies, with money circulating through various hands and supporting multiple livelihoods beyond just the prostitutes themselves. Understanding these hidden communities requires looking beyond official records. Archaeologists studying medieval urban sites have found evidence in the locations of buildings, the types of artefacts recovered, and the patterns of waste disposal. Historians have traced property ownership and rental agreements. Literary scholars have analysed how medieval fiction portrayed these spaces. What emerges is a picture of complex social worlds existing in the gaps and margins of medieval society, worlds that official culture pretended not to see, but which were essential to how medieval cities and castles actually functioned. Medieval literature both reveals and obscures these realities. In many texts, prostitutes appear as stock characters, morality tale sinners who meet bad ends as warnings to others. But in other texts, especially in satirical and comic works, prostitutes appear as clever survivors who outwit foolish men and manipulate the system to their advantage. These literary representations tell us something about how medieval people actually viewed prostitutes, not just as sinners, but as wily operators navigating a difficult world. There was a certain grudging respect in some portrayals, an acknowledgement that these women were using the tools available to them to survive. Ballads and popular songs also featured prostitutes, sometimes as tragic figures, sometimes as comic ones, sometimes as romantic leads. These songs circulated among all social classes, meaning that people of all backgrounds were consuming stories about prostitutes that were more complex than simple moral condemnation. The figure of the prostitute with a heart of gold appears even in medieval literature, the woman who is technically sinful but fundamentally good-hearted, who helps heroes, who shows kindness to the poor, who redeems herself through love or sacrifice. This trope suggests that even in a society that officially despised prostitutes, there was some recognition of their humanity and moral complexity. But we must be careful not to romanticize. Literary representations were created by men for male audiences. They reflected male fantasies about prostitutes, not prostitutes' own realities. The clever prostitute of satire, the good-hearted prostitute of romance. These were characters designed to entertain men, not portraits of real women. Real women's voices are almost entirely absent from medieval records. We have no diaries of prostitutes, no letters, no first-hand accounts of their experiences in their own words. Everything we know comes filtered through male observers, and usually hostile ones at that. This absence is itself significant. It tells us that these women's perspectives were considered worthless. Not worth recording, not worth preserving, not worth listening to. Their lives mattered only insofar as they served male needs or illustrated male moral points. Modern historians have tried to reconstruct these women's experiences through careful reading of available sources. Court records sometimes preserve details about women's lives even while condemning them. Economic records show patterns of women's earnings and expenditures. Archaeological evidence reveals how people actually lived regardless of what official culture said they should be doing. From these fragments, a picture emerges of women who are neither the purely evil sinners of sermons nor the romantic figures of literature, but human beings making difficult choices in constrained circumstances, women who loved and grieved, who protected their children, who formed friendships, who found moments of joy alongside suffering, who were complex and human in all the ways that official history refused to acknowledge. The hidden history of medieval prostitutes matters because it reveals truths about medieval society that the official histories obscure. It shows that castles were not just romantic places of chivalry and nobility, they were sites of exploitation and abuse. It shows that medieval Christianity's moral teachings existed alongside practical systems that completely contradicted those teachings. It shows that women's labour, including sexual labour, was essential to medieval economies even when that labour was despised. This history also matters because these women's descendants are alive today. The exploitation and survival, the trauma and resilience, the humanity denied and the dignity asserted, all of these echo forward through generations. Understanding this history helps us understand the long continuities of women's oppression and women's resistance. And finally, this history matters because it insists on remembering people whom society wanted to forget. Every prostitute who walked through a medieval castle town, who served ale in a tavern, who negotiated with a soldier, who survived another day, was a human being whose life had value and meaning, regardless of what history chose to record. Now, as we near the end of our exploration, let us reflect on what these stories mean and why they continue to resonate centuries later. Part 10. Reflections and Resonances. We have journeyed through the lives of medieval prostitutes, through the castles and taverns where they worked, through the violence and disease they endured, through the social systems that exploited them, and the rare paths to survival they found. Now we pause to reflect on what this hidden history means, both for understanding medieval Europe and for our own time. The most fundamental insight is that prostitution in medieval times was not primarily about sex. It was about power and economics. In a society where women had almost no economic power, almost no legal rights, and almost no socially acceptable ways to survive outside of marriage or the convent, prostitution became one of the few available options for women without family support. This challenges simplistic narratives about prostitution as being about individual moral failure or simple sexual desire. Medieval prostitution was a social system, created and maintained by economic inequality, gender hierarchy, and the absence of alternatives for vulnerable women. The men who used prostitutes were exercising power. The power to buy access to women's bodies, the power to treat lower status women as objects, the power that came from having money and status in a deeply hierarchical society. Their choices created the demand that drove the system. The women who worked as prostitutes were surviving, navigating impossible circumstances with the tools available to them. Their choices were constrained to the point where calling them choices requires us to acknowledge how limited they were. But within those constraints, women exercised agency. They negotiated, they protected themselves as best they could, they formed communities, they resisted when possible. Understanding this dynamic helps us see medieval prostitution not as an aberration, but as a logical outcome of medieval social structures, a society that denied women economic independence, that treated women's bodies as male property, that offered women almost no safe paths to survival. Such a society inevitably produced prostitution. The castle environment crystallized these dynamics. Castles concentrated male power, military, political, economic. They housed men who were trained in violence and who viewed domination as their right. They operated according to hierarchies where lower status people, especially women, existed primarily to serve higher status people. In this environment, prostitution was not a marginal phenomenon, but a central feature of how the system operated. It absorbed male sexual demand in ways that protected the honor of noble families. It served as an outlet for soldiers' aggression. It provided a hidden economy that enriched multiple parties, and it sacrificed vulnerable women to maintain the stability of the larger social order. The Church's role reveals perhaps the deepest hypocrisy, an institution that claimed moral authority, that preached chastity and condemned lust, was deeply complicit in prostitution. It provided theological justification for tolerance. It profited from owning or licensing brothels. Individual clergy were often clients. And yet it continued to condemn prostitutes as sinners, while the system that created prostitution remained unchanged. This contradiction between stated values and actual practice is not unique to medieval Christianity or prostitution. It appears throughout history whenever societies claim moral principles while maintaining systems that violate those principles. The medieval church's approach to prostitution is simply one particularly clear example of this pattern. The violence that prostitutes experienced was not incidental. It was structural. The system depended on women's vulnerability. If prostitutes had genuine legal protection, if they could refuse dangerous clients, if they could seek justice for violence against them, if they could organise for better conditions, the entire system would have operated differently. Instead, violence served to maintain prostitutes' subordination. It enforced the power hierarchy. It reminded women constantly of their vulnerability, and it ensured that prostitution remained a trap that was easy to enter, but almost impossible to escape from with dignity and security intact. Disease played a similar role. The absence of effective treatment for sexually transmitted infections, the lack of understanding about disease transmission, the stigma that prevented women from seeking care. All of this kept prostitutes sick, shortened their careers, and ensured a constant supply of new desperate women to replace those who aged out or died. If medieval society had genuinely wanted to reduce prostitution, it would have addressed the economic conditions that created it, would have provided alternatives for women without family support, would have enforced laws against violence toward prostitutes, would have offered medical care. Instead, society chose to condemn prostitutes morally, while maintaining the economic and social conditions that made prostitution necessary for many women's survival. This reveals something important about how oppression functions. It is not enough to simply condemn individuals for making choices within constrained systems. We must examine the constraints themselves, the structures that limit choices, the systems that create vulnerability, the power dynamics that turn some people's survival into others' profit. Medieval prostitutes made choices, but they made them within a system designed to exploit them at every turn. Understanding this helps us develop more complex moral frameworks for thinking about both historical and contemporary issues. The hidden economies surrounding prostitution also reveal how history is written. Official records focus on what those in power considered important: military campaigns, property transfers, legal cases, church councils. They rarely record the experiences of poor women, and almost never record those experiences from the women's own perspectives. This means that the history we have inherited is incomplete. It tells us about kings and bishops and knights, but it obscures the lives of the majority of people who lived under their rule. Women's history, poor people's history, the history of marginalised groups, these have had to be reconstructed from fragments and read between the lines of sources that were not interested in preserving them. The history of medieval prostitution is one example of these hidden histories, but there are countless others, stories of peasants and servants, craftsmen and beggars, disabled people and ethnic minorities, all of whom lived full and complex lives that history largely ignored. Recovering these histories matters because it gives us a more complete and accurate picture of the past. It challenges romantic narratives about medieval chivalry and piety by showing the exploitation and suffering that existed alongside them. It reveals the human cost of social systems that concentrated power and wealth in few hands, while leaving many people desperate. And it insists that all lives have value and meaning, even lives that those in power considered worthless. Every prostitute who survived the medieval period was a person with hopes and fears, relationships and experiences, moments of happiness and long stretches of suffering. Their lives mattered, not because of what they contributed to the powerful, but because of their inherent human dignity. This historical exploration also resonates with contemporary issues. Prostitution still exists. Women still face economic vulnerability and limited options. Violence against sex workers remains prevalent and largely unpunished. Social stigma still marks women who sell sex while leaving their clients unscathed. Legal systems still struggle with how to address prostitution, oscillating between criminalisation and various forms of regulation. Understanding medieval prostitution does not provide simple answers to contemporary debates. The contexts are different in crucial ways. Modern contraception, medical care, legal systems, economic structures, and social attitudes all differ significantly from medieval ones. But the historical continuities are also striking. The vulnerability of women without economic options, the male sexual entitlement that creates demand, the violence that enforces hierarchies, the moral condemnation that coexists with practical tolerance, the hidden economies that support multiple parties beyond just the women doing sex work, the difficulty of escape once trapped in the system. These patterns suggest that prostitution is not just about individual choices or moral failings. It is deeply connected to how societies organise gender, sexuality, power, and economics. Addressing prostitution seriously requires addressing these larger systems. not just condemning individuals. Medieval Europe never addressed these systems. Instead, it maintained prostitution as a permanent feature of social life, condemned in theory, tolerated and regulated in practice, and supported by the very economic and social structures that created it. The women who lived and worked as prostitutes deserve to be remembered, not as anonymous sinners or statistics, but as human beings who navigated impossible circumstances with whatever resources they had. Their resilience in the face of overwhelming exploitation speaks to the fundamental human drive to survive, and to find meaning even in the hardest conditions. Their stories also serve as a reminder of what happens when societies fail to provide for their most vulnerable members. When economic security is impossible, when violence is tolerated, when legal protection is unavailable, when social support is denied, people find ways to survive anyway, but the cost is enormous, measured in shortened lives, accumulated trauma, and human potential destroyed. This is the legacy of medieval prostitution, a hidden history of survival and exploitation, resistance and oppression, humanity asserted in the face of systems designed to deny it. It is a history that challenges us to look honestly at the past, to acknowledge the suffering that existed alongside the art and architecture and literature we admire, to remember the people who were forgotten. As you drift towards sleep now, let these stories remain with you. Let them complicate your understanding of history. Let them remind you that every society has hidden corners where exploitation happens, and that those corners are maintained by the choices societies make about who matters and who does not. The medieval prostitutes are long gone, centuries dead, their bodies turned to dust, their names mostly forgotten, but their lives were real, their suffering was real, their resilience was real, and their history, recovered now from fragments and silences, demands to be told. Epilogue: The Echoes Forward. The medieval period ended, but the structures that created and sustained prostitution did not simply disappear. They evolved, adapted, persisted into new forms. Understanding what happened after the medieval period helps us see both the changes and the troubling continuities. As Europe transitioned from medieval to early modern periods, prostitution continued but under changing conditions. The Protestant Reformation brought new religious approaches, some more repressive, others differently hypocritical. The rise of nation-states created new forms of regulation. Urban growth and early capitalism transformed economics, but women's vulnerability remained a constant. The Renaissance and early modern periods saw increasing medicalization of prostitution. As syphilis spread through Europe after 1492, authorities became more concerned with disease control. This led to mandatory health inspections for prostitutes in some places, systems that subjected women to invasive examinations while leaving their clients unexamined and unregulated. The Enlightenment brought new philosophical frameworks for thinking about prostitution, but did not fundamentally change women's economic options or social status. The Industrial Revolution created new forms of labour for poor women, but also new forms of exploitation, including industrial prostitution in factory towns. Colonialism exported European attitudes toward prostitution to other parts of the world, often disrupting indigenous approaches to sexuality and gender in favour of European Christian morality. Colonial authorities regulated prostitution in colonies to protect soldiers and administrators, continuing the patterns established in medieval castles, but now on a global scale. The 19th and 20th centuries saw reform movements aimed at ending prostitution. Some focused on rescue and rehabilitation, others on criminalization, still others on addressing economic root causes. These movements achieved some changes, but prostitution persisted because of the underlying conditions that create it. Economic inequality, gender hierarchy, limited options for poor women also persisted. Contemporary debates about prostitution, whether to criminalize it, legalize and regulate it, or decriminalize it entirely, echo medieval discussions in important ways. The question of whether prostitution can ever be truly consensual when economic desperation is involved remains unresolved. The question of how to protect sex workers from violence, while also addressing the exploitation inherent in the industry, continues to divide activists and policymakers. What the medieval history teaches us is that societies have lived with these contradictions for centuries. condemning prostitution morally while tolerating or facilitating it practically, using sex workers' bodies while denying sex workers' humanity, claiming to want to end prostitution while maintaining the systems that create it. Breaking this pattern requires more than moral condemnation or legal reform. It requires addressing economic inequality so that survival does not depend on selling sex. It requires challenging gender hierarchies so that women are not systematically denied resources and opportunities. It requires confronting male sexual entitlement and the violence it enables. It requires building societies where all people have genuine options for living with dignity. Medieval Europe did not do this work, and in many ways, contemporary societies have not done it either. The names have changed, the laws are different, the specific conditions have evolved, but the fundamental dynamics remain recognizable. The hidden history of medieval prostitutes thus becomes more than just a historical curiosity. It becomes a lens through which to examine persistent patterns of exploitation, a reminder that societies can live with contradictions for centuries without resolving them, and a challenge to do better. As you settle into sleep now, let this long journey through history fade into dreams. Let the voices of forgotten women whisper at the edges of your consciousness. Let the complexity of the past inform how you think about the present. And remember, history is not just about kings and castles, battles and dates. It is also about the hidden lives, the marginalized people, the stories that were almost lost. Every society has these hidden corners. Every era has people whose experiences were not recorded in official histories, but whose lives were real and full and human. Medieval prostitutes lived in those hidden corners, in the shadows of castles, in the back rooms of taverns, in the narrow streets of red light districts. They survived as best they could in a world that used them and condemned them in equal measure. Their hidden history is now told, recovered from fragments, spoken into the darkness, remembered at last. Sleep now, and in sleeping, honour the memory of forgotten women, whose lives mattered then, and whose stories matter still. This has been The Secret Life of Medieval Prostitutes, a Sleepless Survivors production. Good night.